Thank you. Everyone can hear me okay? All right, so welcome to PyCon Canada. Welcome to Toronto. For some of you maybe, welcome to Canada. What I am going to talk to you about today is being a programmer. I assume many of you in this room are programmers. And oftentimes in this line of work, we deal with problems, we deal with issues. That's what we do. We have to figure things out. Once in a rare while, we are given the opportunity to find the perfect solution to something at exactly the right time. And that is what I want to talk to you about today. Spoiler alert, the solution was the GitHub Deployments API. Now, I work at Rackspace, and at Rackspace, I have the job of building internal tools. So these are tools used by my fellow coworkers. And if you've not done that sort of work before, let me tell you, it's a real pleasure, treat, honor, everything. It's fantastic. Building products for a customer is great, and I've done that before, but there's something special about being able to build tools that make the lives of your coworkers better. The same coworkers that you see and speak to every day. Now, today I want to tell you a story about one such tool that we built, and this tool is for our customer support staff. If you're not familiar with Rackspace, we take customer support very, very seriously. It's job number one at Rackspace, to treat our customers right. The particular tool that we built for our support floor is called Origin. What Origin does doesn't matter for the purpose of this talk. It really doesn't matter, but I'm going to reference it by name a few times, so it's good to have a name to give. And in particular, I don't want to talk about Origin. I want to talk about the deployments pipeline that we built to allow my fellow developers to build Origin and deploy Origin to actual infrastructure. Thus, what I really want to talk about is a tool for building a tool. That's what I focused on at the end of the day. Now, 2016 has been a very busy year for my team. We came up with the idea for Origin in January at the end of the month, and we knew it was a big job and a big task, but it could really help people out, and we presented it to our VP, and almost instantly he gave us approval. So that's fantastic. That's what you want. It was a big job though. Like I said, we had 9 months to get it all done because for various reasons, if we didn't get Origin released by the end of October, it almost wasn't worth doing. We had to get it done by the end of October. So, all right. We had just completed another incredibly successful project on my team. We felt confident we can do this. No big deal. We get to work, we start designing, prototyping, coding some stuff up. Very quickly, as is often the case, we need some infrastructure to actually run Origin on. That's the way things work these days. Again, this is 2016. Cloud servers and VMs, not hard to come by, especially if you work at a place like Rackspace. They're all over. So we're getting ready to get some infrastructure in place, and then I talked to our ops folks, our wonderful ops folks, and they tell me something thrilling. They were about to roll out new infrastructure for internal tools based on Marathon and Mesos, which would be used for very easily building Docker images and deploying Docker images. This wouldn't be a modern conference talk if I didn't say Docker at some point. Now, in front of all of this awesome infrastructure, they were developing their own API called Maestro. And Maestro would provide us as developers with a very simple way to build Docker images and then deploy them with only having to worry about the minimal things. So what does this API look like? Basically, it's this. There's a build endpoint, which takes a GitHub repository as part of the payload. It takes the branch you want to build, and it takes your desired Docker tag. Once you've done that, you call the deploy endpoint. You pass in that Docker tag. You give a little bit of information about where exactly you wanted to get deployed, and you're done. So this is kind of like an internal Heroku if you're used to Heroku. We point you at we point the API at a GitHub repository. It automatically builds the application that lives in that repository, and then it deploys it and is running. Awesome. We're all thrilled. So the team gets to work. We're coding, building, developing, deploying. Everything is great until one day, everything is not so great. Something goes wrong. So what happens? This is pretty early into our life cycle. What went wrong? Well, as I said, our deploys are based on two API endpoints. So how were we doing deploys at the time? Well, we were just using curl in terminal. I'd sit there at my computer, run curl, pass the payload, pass an auth token, hit the endpoint. So were all my coworkers. One day, I go to do a deploy. Simultaneously, one of my coworkers in Texas, she decides that she's going to do a deploy too. Hers goes out just after mine. It ends up her code is running instead of my code. Now, she's an awesome programmer. Her code is probably better than mine anyway. Not the worst thing in the world, but obviously that's not going to be sustainable long term. So what do we do about this? Well, easy answer, we'll just go to Slack. Anytime someone's going to do a deploy, write a message, say, hey, I have a deploy to do. Is this okay? Everyone says, sure. You go ahead, you do your deploy. Solve the problem. At least I've solved the problem for now. One of the things I haven't mentioned about Origin is that an end goal is to have developers across the entire company contribute to it and do deploys on their own. We really want a CI/CD process with this in the future. I don't know how well this is going to scale when we've got people all over trying to do deploys, but future me can worry about that. Present me doesn't care. So let's get back to work. We're a couple days later, we're still coding, doing deploys, we're saying things in Slack every time we do it. And I go to do this deploy right here. It's some Docker tag, doesn't matter. To some environment, doesn't matter. Except I screwed up. I put the wrong environment ID in there. Instead of 46, it was supposed to be 40, or instead of 45, it's supposed to be 46. I accidentally deployed my application on top of someone else who was using Maestro. They didn't even have anything to do with Origin. They didn't know what Origin was, but they reload their browser and suddenly my app is running there instead of theirs. They were not happy about that. That was not a good place to be. Okay, so how are we going to deal with this problem? Because these are simple endpoints, but we have to generate this JSON every time. Well, we'll just double and triple check it. That's it. Before you do a deploy, just double check your work. It'll be fine. Yeah, that's not great, but as programmers, life often sucks. We can deal with this. That's nothing. All right, so we're now talking in Slack and we're double, triple checking our deploys. Time to do a demo for our VP, the very same VP that gave us that, yes, go ahead at the beginning. He wants to see what after a couple weeks, where we're at, what we've been doing. So we get our final code together, get a pull request ready for it. We deploy the pull request for the demo. Everything looks great. A couple minutes before the demo itself, I notice a small little problem. And I say, I don't want the VP to see that problem. I push up a quick fix, deploy it, walk off to the demo. Except I wasn't very patient here. All right, I'm often not. What happens? Well, that fix I pushed up ended up failing in our automated tests. The thing is, our deploy system, the curls, they had no idea that we even had automated tests. I had to sit there and wait and make sure that the tests passed, and the test didn't pass, and I broke everything. Fortunately, everyone in the demo was good-natured. I pushed up a real quick fix, deployed that, and eventually the PR did, in fact, go green. But this is one more thing we've got to deal with. We've got to deal with patience and waiting for this. All right, so another week or so goes by, and our incredible designers are ready to do their thing. They've got us great wireframes and mockups. They want to get to work on the CSS for the application. Perfect. They're coding, local development, it all works great. They want to be able to do deploys as well. So they come to me and they say, Jay, what do we have to do to deploy to this awesome new infrastructure you're telling everybody about? I said, it's easy. All you have to do is generate a short-lived 2auth token using your your two-factor authentication, generate a JSON payload, send that JSON payload to the appropriate endpoint, generate a second JSON payload, send that to the appropriate endpoint. And don't forget to tell us in Slack every time you do it, and don't forget to triple check your work, and make sure you're waiting for the PR. Now, I don't know about your designers. My designers were not thrilled with that, and who can blame them? So let's step back for a second and see where we're really at with all this. We have awesome new infrastructure. The infrastructure really is incredible. It's doing exactly what's promised. Except it's too easy to deploy in isolation. When your deploys are based on a developer just running curl from the command line, you can have someone in Hamilton and someone in San Antonio doing deploys simultaneously, and you're going to have trouble. Now, conceptually, the deploys are simple. It's curl with a bit of JSON. That's awesome. We're devs. We love JSON. We love curl. But it's sort of easy to mess up the JSON. I did it myself. Lots of people have done it. And the deploys have no notion of the fact that we've got lots of great tests running on every pull request. That's not getting brought in. And it's not really simple for everyone. Like for devs that are used to curl and used to JSON payloads, yeah, it's not bad. But for our designers who are Photoshop and Illustrator experts, they don't want to do that. That's not actually easy for them. So given where we're at, what's next? Where are we going to go from here? Really? A Buffy slide and no one laughed at that? Are there no other Buffy fans in the room? Come on, people. Easy answer, Jenkins. This is what Jenkins is made for, all right? Like, nothing's easier to set up. Nothing has a better user interface. And who at PyCon does not love writing extensions in XML and Java? Like, this is a dream. Now, to be honest, my team has extensive experience with Jenkins. We have lots and lots of projects that use Jenkins. We use it very heavily. But for Origin, with what we were building, it didn't feel quite right. With the eventual goal of having dozens of developers doing continuous deploys against it, wanting to have visibility into when those developers are doing it, and some of the extension ideas we were thinking about for the future, like automated emails on a deploy to prod and automated texts if a deploy happens to fail, Jenkins didn't feel quite right for what we wanted to do. We know how to use it. We could have made it work, but it didn't feel quite right. And then I came across a blog post that would go on to define my work for the rest of the year. Deploying branches to github.com. This is a fantastic post. This talks about, or this is written by a developer at GitHub, and it talks about how they deploy GitHub itself. So when you go to github.com, you are running the GitHub application. This is how they deploy it. This is how they deploy it hundreds of times per week. All right, you probably didn't know that. GitHub.com is updated hundreds of times per week. And in this blog post, they detail a chat-based deployment system they had created. Now, that sounds kind of cool. Why would you want to do a chat-based deploy? Well, first off, deploys actually are simple. One command there, no JSON blobs, no nothing like that. You just write one command, and there's a Hubot or a chatbot, whatever you want to call it, sitting there listening for these messages, and if it receives the deployment message, it will go and actually start the deployment. That's pretty cool. The other thing you get by having it in chat is you get instant visibility into deploys. Right? The Hubot is only allowed to respond to deploy requests from one Slack channel, meaning anyone who's a member of that Slack channel gets instant visibility. This isn't a Jenkins UI at some random DNS entry that someone is clicking go on. This is Slack, and I don't know about you, I can't work without Slack anymore. This is where you are all day, so you get that visibility into what everyone else is doing. They get some other really cool things by doing it, or with what they've done with their chatbot. They get auditability. They can just ask the chatbot to show them all of the recent deploys. And you can see here, GitHub, you can see who did a deploy of what code to which environment when. So you get a really nice log of all the recent stuff that's gone on. And the blog post talks about some other really cool things too, like environment locking. So if one person's deploying to production, they get an automatic lock for production, and no one else is even allowed to deploy to production until they release that lock. The Hubot won't allow it to happen. So I read through this post, and I say to myself, this is awesome. This is what I want. I want a chatbot to do our deploys. I can take their ideas, and I can build them myself. But a chatbot is not why we're here today, not really. There's a whole conferences dedicated just to chatbots, and this is not one of them. So, I read through the post, and there's something very interesting, and that's the real reason we're here today. There's a link to some documentation that I had never seen before, and this is documentation for GitHub's Deployments API. Now, I'd never heard of it. I didn't know what it was. I said, what does this do? The blog post says it's very key to the whole system, but they don't really talk about it. They just link off to it. Does it mean that the chatbot can tell the GitHub Deployments API to do my deploy to Maestro? Will GitHub be deploying to Maestro itself? No, that doesn't make sense. GitHub doesn't know anything about Maestro. They don't know anything about the literally tens of millions of different deploy systems all around the world. So what then? If the GitHub Deployments API is not actually deploying your code, what do you use it for? Well, the short answer is glue. As we'll see, the GitHub Deployments API is going to glue together disparate pieces of your deployment pipeline, put them together in a nice way. It's also going to offer us some really cool features which we'll get into. I kind of likened this to the way that Python itself is used at a lot of companies. Python is often used to tie together the outputs and inputs of different systems, take advantage of the really great standard library, transform the data a little bit before passing it along. This is the kind of thing Python's good at. That's what the Deployments API is used for. So let's step back from the deployments API just for a second and propose this. What if I just wrote a chatbot that did everything? Like it did all the work to do the deploy and got me all those features I wanted, like the PR checks and branch freshness and all this stuff. Could we do that? Of course we could. Nothing's stopping us from doing that. But in my eyes, that puts a little bit too much load on what the chatbot is really intended to do, because then your chatbot is going to have to know how to speak to your infrastructure that's actually getting deployed onto. It will have to have, your chatbot will have to have a notion of pull request statuses to know whether the pull request tests have completed, whether they've succeeded or failed. The chatbot will also have to know how to check branch freshness. That means someone isn't deploying something to prod that isn't up to date with master. Some really old branch. It's going to have to know how to check that sort of thing. If you want to log deployment histories for the auditability I talked about before, the chatbot is now going to have a persistent store to log all that. You've got to come up with a database schema on your own, figure all that out. And if you want to enforce any other process into your pipeline, you have to code that into the chatbot as well. So this could be something like if a junior dev creates a PR, it's not allowed to be deployed until a senior dev gives an LGTM, or looks good to me, on it. You can encode that right into your process if you want, but you'd have to do it directly in the chatbot. And finally, I mentioned earlier, we have some ideas for extensibility going into the future, and this would mean every feature you want to add or every other system you want to talk to, the chatbot has to know how to talk to that as well. In my eyes, a chatbot should know how to sit in Slack, it should know how to parse particular messages, and then call out to some other service to actually act on those messages. So what I proposed was, let's put something else in between. Let's have a continuous integration server of some type that goes in between the chatbot and our Maestro infrastructure. This could be Jenkins, or it could be something you did on your own. We put together a small Flask API, very, very minimal. And it can worry about the Git-related stuff, like it can worry about the pull request checking, the branch freshness, and it can worry about Maestro. Chatbot just has to listen for messages. So that's good. Where might the GitHub Deployments API come in if we decide to do this? Well, one problem with this is that you're going to have to come up with the APIs between the chatbot and the CI server on your own. That's not the worst thing in the world. We've all come up with APIs before. I try to avoid coming up with new APIs if I can help it, because there might be something better out there already that already has standards and people have used it. And that is one of the things that the deployments API is going to give you. If you put the deployments API in the middle of your pipeline, it is going to give you a very clean endpoint to start deployments, and then using GitHub's very standard webhook system, it can then notify anyone who's interested that a deployment has begun, and those interested parties can act on it. So in our case, the chatbot will send a message to GitHub that says, we'd like to create a deployment. GitHub will then look for registered webhooks and say, hey, the CI server is interested in it. Tell the CI server with a webhook. Okay, so that's kind of cool, but you may be saying to yourself, is he really coming up here and telling us that the whole reason you use this is so you don't have to write your own API? That doesn't seem like a great reason for a talk. And you're right, that would not be a great reason for a talk. So let's think about some of the things that I did wrong before. The big one being that demo where I said, I'm just going to deploy, the PR tests will go green. That's fine. Let's not worry about it. If I had had the GitHub Deployments API in the middle and I tried to do that, what do you think GitHub would have said about that? It would have said no. This is GitHub. It knows your pull requests. It knows you're deploying something that has a pull request associated with it. It checks whether all your tests have completed and whether they've succeeded or not. And what about something like this? This is what I mean when I say branch freshness. Someone creates a branch called our new feature off of point B, develop, and then they're ready to release it, except they didn't check if new things have been merged to master and deployed to prod. What would you do if someone tried to deploy this feature here out to production and it went through the deployments API? Well, the GitHub Deployments API would take care of that for us too. All right, it knows your repository. This is GitHub we're talking about. It knows whether a branch is up to date. It will automatically do that work for you. So what else? What other kinds of things? Well, I talked about auditability before. That comes for free when you use the GitHub Deployments API. If you funnel your deployments through the API, GitHub will automatically do the work of logging them for you and then gives you a very nice endpoint for retrieving all of the current ones, and that are all the recent ones. And that is what GitHub themselves are taking advantage of when I showed that picture before. GitHub knows, or GitHub is logging that, and our chatbot can just take advantage of it. Anything else? Like what other cool things might the Deployments API give us? Well, I like this one. So if you're anything like me, you spend 99% of your time in the GitHub UI looking at pull requests. There's often not a lot of reason to use it otherwise. You're there to look at pull requests. So here's a sample one I did called required context tests. And right there in the pull request, GitHub has added this information saying that I did a deploy to production of this branch 6 days ago. I then went and I pushed a couple more commits on. You can see those there, just the normal pull request interface. And then I did another deploy to production, and GitHub showed that right there. So right in the pull request page itself, you get some context and visibility into what has happened, what the history of this particular pull request is with respect to the different environments that you can deploy to. So what does the deployments API actually look like? Like from the chatbot point of view, what does a chatbot call out? It's a very simple endpoint. You specify the repository in the URL, and then you give a ref, so that's going to be a branch or a tag or a SHA. You give the environment you want to deploy to, and that's an arbitrary string. GitHub doesn't care. GitHub doesn't know anything about our environments. You just give it a string. And then required context. And what's a required context? Those are the individual checks in your pull request. All right, so here I've got two for my pull request, one called automated tests and one called linter. What this means is that when a deployment happens, GitHub will not allow that deployment to actually start unless both automated tests and linter have completed and have passed successfully. Now, what does GitHub do once it receives this API call? Well, first it checks the required context, it makes sure the branch is fresh, it does all the other stuff I talked about before, and then it creates what I call a deployment object. And what's that? Well, it's just like a little JSON blob that has the ref, so that's the branch or the tag. It has the actual SHA that's being deployed, the repository that you're deploying from, the environment you're deploying to, and the GitHub user who initiated the deployment. So the same sort of stuff that was in the API call. And then what does GitHub do with this information? Webhooks. It sends this off to anyone who is registered as an interested party. I mentioned webhooks a few times already. If you're not familiar with them, this is what they look like. They are something you can set on your repository to tell GitHub that it should call or it should send a message to a particular URL whenever an interesting event happens in your repo. And the interesting event I'm talking about today is deployments. So whenever a deployment is successfully created, GitHub will scan through your repository's webhooks and say, hey, was anybody interested in deployments? i.e., do they have that checkbox? And if they do, GitHub will send a JSON blob to the URL at the top there containing all the information. So I have my CI server just listening, waiting for these JSON blobs to come in from GitHub. And it knows that if it receives a JSON blob, everything's been checked. The PR tests are good, the branch freshness is good, everything is good, the CI server can actually begin its job. Now, with Maestro, we have a two-stage deployment. First, we build the Docker image, and then we spin it up. I, as a user deploying, would like to know where we are in that stage. I'd also like to know if there's an error. So what does GitHub allow us to do to communicate errors back from the CI server to the Hubot, for example? Well, it provides another endpoint called the deployment status updates. So for a given deployment, you can update the status. You can say, this deployment is now pending with some random arbitrary description, so building Docker image. And you can optionally give a URL that the user can click on to see what's going on with the deployment. Now, what's interesting is that the CI server is going to call that, but the CI server has no idea about the Hubot. And the Hubot has no idea about the CI server. All they care about is GitHub. GitHub is sitting in the middle. So the CI server calls this endpoint, GitHub receives it, and then GitHub is going to say, was anybody interested in deployment status updates? It'll look through its webhooks. We've got a separate one here, so at the top, that's a different URL. That's a URL for our Hubot. And the Hubot is listening for deployment status updates. So now the CI server can just send status updates as quickly as it gets them, and only interested parties will receive them. The CI server doesn't have to send them to the Hubot. It just sends it to GitHub and wipes its hands of it. The Hubot then will receive that deployment status and can put information like this into Slack. It'll say, jparlar's deployment 820 of blah, blah, blah is now running. In the description, we're building Docker image with this particular tag. So again, the Hubot actually doesn't know anything about our CI server, but it's able to receive information via the webhooks. It's all hands-off. GitHub just takes care of all of it for us. Now, I've got a couple more minutes, so what I'm going to do is just show a little bit of code from the CI server to try to give you an idea of what it actually looks like to interact with GitHub and to do this work. Before I do that, I'm going to call out to the GitHub 3.py library. It's written by a friend of mine and a fellow Rackspace employee. It's an amazing, amazing Python library for wrapping up almost all of GitHub's APIs. It gives you really nice access to call GitHub APIs. I love this thing. It's really made my life a lot easier this year. So here's a very simple Flask handler. All right, so this is the function that receives the webhooks from GitHub. And it doesn't really have to do all that much. You can see right here it checks what the particular event type is. This could be a deployment or a pull request or all sorts of things. It does some verification to make sure the message is actually coming from GitHub and not from some random person that wants to kick off a deploy. And then it just says, all right, if the deployment or if the payload type or if the event type was a deployment, let's call the function I wrote called webhooks.deployment, and we pass in that payload. So that's sort of it for receiving the webhooks from GitHub. We then have to go and act on it. And that I show here, the text is a little bit smaller. Again, it's not too important, but what I do is I have a function where I kick off the deploy. I have a nice repository object provided by the GitHub 3 library, so it wraps up the concept of a GitHub repository as a Python object. Same with the deployment. I've got an object that represents this individual deployment. I can then, if this function call doesn't fail, i.e. doesn't raise an exception, then I'll immediately create a status update with a state of success and a description of deployed and a target URL that shows like the logging information that happened to build that. Then I talked a little bit before about encoding process into your deployments, like extra things you might want to check for. So we do a couple of special things. For instance, if the deployment environment was production, like the real environment that our end users are going to be taking advantage of, we do a couple other things. We have an additional check or an additional status check in our pull requests that's related to whether or not a production deploy has happened. And then if it's production and if someone was deploying the master branch, what that means for us is that someone was doing a rollback, that there was a bad deploy to production, so they want to redeploy master to make sure we're all good. So then, in that case, I'm able to just do something else special, the clear prod deployment status. What it does doesn't matter. And we've got this exception here, which ties back into the try at the top. And what do we do if something failed with the deploy? Well, we just do another deployment status update, and we say the state was failure, and we give a description, and we give a URL that someone can look at to see what went on there. All right, and now here's an example of, I said when we deploy to prod, we add an additional status check, and that's what this one is right here. I'll set that to green whenever a PR eventually goes to prod. That kind of means that the PR is done, it's allowed to be merged in now. And so where are we today with this system? Well, everything worked. We released on time before the end of October. It all basically worked first try, a couple little issues here and there, but it worked. Our support employees like it. It's working for them. It's helping them get their job done better. We currently have about a dozen employees doing deploys with this system, so it's working really well. And not only are they deploying Origin with this system, but we were able to build the pipeline in such a way that anyone who's using Maestro can use this. So we've got 4 or 5 other projects that have nothing at all to do with Origin that we're able to take advantage of our deployment pipeline system. And a lot of that is thanks to what the GitHub Deployments API gave us. It took out a lot of the tedious work of checking pull requests, checking branch freshness, all of that, and it just did that. It gave us a clean API, let me focus on what actually needed to be focused on, and let my team do deploys without having to worry about all the problems we ran into those first couple weeks. And with that, my time is up. I'm not going to be taking questions here, but I will take them out in the hall afterwards. Thank you very much.